When Landon Noel found the girl collapsed against his barn door that October morning, her lips blue as winter sky and a baby's cry piercing the dawn silence, he didn't know that by sunrise his world would be turned inside out by something as simple as feathers. The wind cut across his Montana ranch like a blade, carrying the scent of early snow and something else, desperation, maybe, or the kind of fear that clings to a person's skin like smoke. Landon pulled his coat tighter as he approached the figure huddled against the weathered wood, his boots crunching through frost that had formed overnight. A young woman, maybe 22, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. "Ma'am." His voice came out rougher than intended. 3 years of living alone on this godforsaken stretch of land had worn away most of his social graces, leaving him more comfortable with cattle and horses than people. The isolation had been intentional, a way to escape the memories that haunted every corner of his former life. "You all right?" She looked up at him with those haunted eyes, clutching a bundle of blankets that squirmed and fussed. Her face was pale as fresh cream, marked by exhaustion and something deeper, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from running too far for too long. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whipped across the open grassland. "My baby, she's hungry, and I ain't got nowhere else to go." Landon's chest tightened like a fist around his heart. He'd spent the last 3 years avoiding anything that reminded him of family, of the life he'd lost when his wife Sarah passed during childbirth, taking their unborn son with her. The sound of an infant's cry was like a knife twisting in an old wound that had never properly healed, a constant ache he'd learned to live with but never overcome. But he couldn't leave them out here. Not with the storm rolling in from the north, dark clouds pregnant with the season's first real snow. The temperature had already dropped 10 degrees since dawn, and the wind carried the bite of winter on its breath. "Come on then," he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the house. "Get inside before you both freeze to death." The woman, she told him her name was Kinsley Parrish, sat by his fireplace nursing her baby daughter while Landon busied himself making coffee and trying not to look at the tender way she held the child. Every movement spoke of fierce protection, of a mother's love that had already been tested by circumstances he could only imagine. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sounds of the baby feeding, punctuated by the increasing wind outside that rattled the windows and promised a long, cold night ahead. "You running from something?" he asked finally, settling into the chair across from her with 2 steaming mugs. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he'd learned to make it during his years as a ranch hand before inheriting this place from his grandfather. Kinsley's hand stilled on her daughter's back. "Ain't we all running from something, Mr. Noel?" "Landon," he corrected, studying her face in the firelight. There were bruises there, faint but visible, fingerprint marks on her wrist that she kept trying to hide with her sleeve, and a shadow of something darker around her left eye that makeup couldn't quite conceal. The sight made his jaw clench with familiar anger. "And I reckon that's true enough. But some things chase harder than others." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flames that danced and flickered in the stone fireplace his grandfather had built with his own hands. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Her daddy, he ain't the kind of man who takes kindly to being left. But I couldn't stay. Not after what he—" She trailed off, pulling the baby closer, her arms forming a protective circle around the small life that depended on her. Landon felt that familiar burn in his chest, the one that came whenever he encountered cruelty directed at those who couldn't defend themselves. It was the same feeling that had driven him to leave his job as sheriff in town, the same anger that had made him retreat to this isolated ranch where he could nurse his grief in peace and avoid the constant reminders of injustices he could know longer stomach fighting. "He won't find you here," he said, and meant it. The Noel Ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that most folks had forgotten existed, surrounded by miles of empty grassland and protected by mountains on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town was a good hour's ride, even in fair weather. Storms coming in hard. Nobody's traveling these roads for at least a few days. Relief flickered across Kinsley's features before she caught herself, as if showing hope might somehow tempt fate to snatch it away. "I can't impose. You ain't imposing." The words came out sharper than he intended, carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of loneliness and the desperate need for human connection he'd been denying. I mean, you can stay until the weather clears. Baby needs warmth and food, and you look like you could use both yourself. As if summoned by his words, the baby finished nursing and let out a small sigh of contentment that seemed to fill the entire room with warmth. Kinsley shifted her to her shoulder, patting gently until a tiny burp emerged. Despite himself, Landon felt his mouth quirk upward at the sound, the first genuine smile he'd managed in months. "What's her name?" he asked, surprised by how much he wanted to know. "Ivy," Kinsley said softly, her voice filled with the kind of love that transformed ordinary words into something sacred. "Ivy Sterling. I gave her my maiden name." There was defiance in her voice, a quiet strength that spoke of battles fought, and one of a woman who had chosen hope over despair despite everything life had thrown at her. Figure she deserves to start fresh, without carrying his shadows. The baby chose that moment to open her eyes, pale blue like her mother's, but clearer somehow, unmarked by whatever hardships had shaped Kinsley's gaze. When those tiny eyes fixed on Landon, something shifted in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands that had held his heart closed for so long. "She's got your eyes," he said, then immediately regretted the intimacy of the observation. But Kinsley smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. "She's got her own everything, I think. Came into this world knowing exactly who she was meant to be." That night, Landon set them up in his spare room, the one he'd been avoiding for 3 years because it had been meant for the nursery. He dug out blankets and pillows, trying to ignore the way his hands shook as he arranged them. When Kinsley asked about a crib, he found himself building one from spare lumber, his carpenter's hands moving with remembered skill. He worked by lamplight while they slept, the sound of his hammer and saw mixing with the wind outside that howled like something wild and desperate. It felt good to be building something instead of just maintaining what was already broken. As he fitted the last board into place, a strange sound made him pause. From the other room came a soft rustling, like wings against glass. But where could wings be coming from in the middle of a storm? Landon set down his hammer and listened. The rustling came again, soft as whispered secrets, followed by what sounded like the gentle cooing of doves. But that was impossible. No birds would be flying in weather like this. With the wind howling like a banshee and snow beginning to dust the windows, he crept toward the spare room, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see Kinsley sleeping peacefully, one arm draped protectively over little Ivy in the makeshift crib he'd just finished. The baby lay still as an angel, her tiny chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The sound came again, and this time Landon was certain it was wings. Dozens of them, maybe more, fluttering against the window like they were trying to get inside. He eased the door open wider and stepped into the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. What he saw made him question his own sanity. White doves perched along the windowsill outside, their feathers pristine despite the storm. They pressed against the glass with an urgency that seemed almost human, their dark eyes fixed not on him, but on the sleeping baby. Snow swirled around them, yet they showed no signs of distress from the cold that should have driven any sensible creature to shelter. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he whispered, crossing himself out of habit learned at his grandmother's knee. One of the doves turned its head and looked directly at him. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and bird regarded each other across the barrier of glass and understanding. Then the dove opened its beak and released a single, pure note that somehow cut through the storm's fury to reach his ears. Kinsley stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The sound broke the spell, and when Landon looked back at the window, the doves were gone. Only the storm remained, raging against the glass with renewed violence. He stood there for a long moment, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion, that's all it was. 3 years of isolation and grief could play tricks on a man's mind, make him see things that weren't there. But when he returned to the main room, he found a single white feather on his kitchen table, soft as silk and gleaming in the lamplight. Morning came gray and bitter, with 2 feet of fresh snow blanketing the ranch and more falling steadily. Landon woke before dawn, as was his habit, and immediately thought of his unexpected guests. He dressed quietly and padded to the kitchen to start coffee, only to find Kinsley already there, heating milk for the baby. "Hope you don't mind," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Ivy's been fussing since before light, and I thought maybe she was still hungry." "Course not." He watched her work, noting the way she moved with practiced efficiency despite her obvious exhaustion. "Sleep all right. Better than I have in months." She glanced toward the window where pale light struggled through the falling snow. "Storm's not letting up, is it?" "No, ma'am. We're likely snowed in for the better part of a week." He poured himself coffee and settled at the table, trying not to think about the feather he'd tucked into his shirt pocket like a talisman. "But there's plenty of food, and the generator's in good shape if we lose power." Kinsley nodded, then suddenly froze. "Landon," she said, her voice tight with something between wonder and fear. "You need to see this." She led him to the spare room, baby Ivy gurgling contentedly in her arms. The crib he'd built stood in the corner where he'd left it, but now it was filled with white feathers. Hundreds of them, soft as down and pure as fresh snow, creating a perfect nest that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "I swear they weren't there when I put her down last night," Kinsley whispered. "I woke up to check on her around 3, and there they were, like someone had been plucking angels." Landon reached out with a trembling hand and touched one of the feathers. It was real, warm, and impossibly soft, with a quality of light that seemed to come from within. "Did you see anything? Hear anything?" "Just the most beautiful singing. Like a choir of voices so pure they made my heart ache." She looked down at Ivy, who was reaching toward the feathers with tiny, grasping fingers. "And she slept through the whole night for the first time since she was born. Didn't fuss once." They stood in silence, watching the baby try to catch the feathers that drifted like snow in the morning light filtering through the window. There was something sacred about the moment, something that made Landon think of his grandmother's stories, about miracles that came disguised as ordinary things. "My gran used to tell me stories," he said finally, his voice rough with memory, "about signs and wonders, about how the Lord sometimes sends his messengers to watch over those who need protecting most." He looked at Kinsley, seeing his own confusion, and awe reflected in her eyes. "She said they don't always look like what you'd expect." "You think that's what this is?" Kinsley asked. "Some kind of sign?" Before Landon could answer, the sound of horses reached them through the storm. Not the steady plodding of work animals, but the urgent thunder of riders pushing their mounts hard despite the weather. His blood went cold as he recognized the sound. He'd heard it too many times during his years as sheriff to mistake it for anything but trouble. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Keep the baby quiet." But Kinsley had gone pale as the feathers surrounding her daughter. "He found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how, but he found me." Through the window, Landon could see dark shapes moving through the snow, at least 4 riders, maybe more. They moved with the confidence of men who'd tracked their prey successfully, who knew their quarry had nowhere left to run. "Who is he?" Landon asked, checking his rifle and sliding extra cartridges into his pocket. "What kind of man is he that he'd ride through a blizzard to drag a woman and baby back?" Kinsley's face crumpled, years of fear and pain finally breaking through her careful composure. "Trey Manning. He owns half the county back in Wyoming, and most of the law enforcement besides. People don't say no to him, and they sure as hell don't run from him." She clutched Ivy tighter, her knuckles white. "I thought maybe if I got far enough away, if I disappeared completely." "You ain't disappearing anywhere," Landon said firmly, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "This is my land, and you're under my protection now." The riders had stopped at the edge of the cleared yard, close enough that he could make out their leader, a big man in an expensive coat, sitting his horse like he owned the world and everything in it. Even through the snow, Landon could see the cruel set of his mouth, the way his men deferred to him with the kind of fear that came from intimate knowledge of his capacity for violence. Trey Manning raised his voice, and it carried easily across the distance. "I know you're in there, Kinsley, and I know you've got my daughter with you." But as Landon watched, one of the white doves landed on Manning's shoulder, and the man didn't even notice. The dove perched on Trey Manning's shoulder like a living contradiction, pure white against the black wool of his coat, serene amid the violence that radiated from the man like heat from a forge. Manning continued shouting threats across the snow-covered yard, completely oblivious to the creature that had chosen him as a perch. "That's impossible," Kinsley breathed, staring through the frost-etched window. "He can't see it." Landon felt the hair on his arms rise. The dove turned its head and looked directly at him through the glass, its dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed ancient and knowing. Then it spread its wings and took flight, circling once above Manning's head, before disappearing into the storm. "Send her out, Noel." Manning's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "I know who you are. Checked with the sheriff in town before I rode out. You're just some broken-down ex-lawman playing at being a hermit. This ain't your fight." "The hell? It ain't," Landon muttered, but his mind was racing. If Manning had talked to Sheriff Dalton, then he knew about Sarah, about why Landon had left his badge behind and retreated to this isolated ranch. He'd know exactly which buttons to push. "I also know about your wife," Manning called out, confirming Landon's fears. "How she died trying to birth your son. You want to go through that kind of loss again? Because that's what you're signing up for if you don't hand over what's mine." Kinsley made a sound like a wounded animal. "He's going to kill you," she whispered. "And then he's going to take Ivy, and I'll never see her again." "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere," Landon said. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see the tactical situation clearly. 4 armed men, possibly more, all with the law likely bought and paid for back in Wyoming. Manning wasn't the type to ride alone into a blizzard unless he was certain of victory. That's when the second impossibility occurred, that a woman stepped out of the storm behind Manning's men, moving through snow that should have been knee-deep, as if she were walking on solid ground. She was elderly, with silver hair braided down her back, and wearing a simple white dress that should have been no protection against the bitter cold. Yet she moved with purpose, her bare feet leaving no tracks in the pristine snow. "Landon, honey," she called out in a voice that carried impossible warmth. "You best let me handle this part." His heart stopped. "Gran." The word escaped him in a whisper, because the woman approaching Manning's riders was his grandmother. The same grandmother who'd been dead and buried these past 5 years. She walked right up to Manning's horse and placed one weathered hand on the animal's neck. The beast, which had been stamping and snorting with nervous energy, immediately calmed. "Trey Manning," she said, her voice carrying easily across the distance despite its gentle tone. "You've come a long way for nothing." Manning's face went slack with confusion. He was looking right at her, but Landon could tell he wasn't seeing her the same way he hadn't seen the dove. Who's there?" Manning called out, his voice less certain now. "Show yourself. I'm standing right in front of you, child," Gran said with infinite patience. "Though I suppose some folks only see what they expect to see. And you ain't expecting much in the way of miracles, are you?" One of Manning's men, a lean, scarred individual who looked like he'd carved his living from other people's suffering, suddenly wheeled his horse around. "Boss, we should go. Something ain't right here." "Nothing's wrong except you're going yellow on me, Cruz," Manning snarled. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. His horse was backing away from Gran despite his efforts to control it, ears flat against its skull. Gran reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew something that gleamed white in the storm light. A feather, identical to the ones filling Ivy's crib. She held it up, and the wind that had been howling suddenly died to perfect stillness. "This child and her mama are under protection now," she announced, her voice somehow reaching every ear despite its conversational tone. "The kind of protection that don't recognize earthly authority or earthly threats. You'd do well to remember that, Trey Manning, before you find yourself facing consequences you can't buy your way out of." Manning's face twisted with rage and something else, fear, maybe, though he'd never admit it. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Noel, but it won't work. That woman stole my property, and I aim to get it back." "Property?" Gran's voice carried a sharp edge now, like winter wind across bare steel. "You talking about that precious baby girl in there? The one you never wanted until her mama found the courage to leave you." "How do you?" Manning started, then caught himself. His men were getting increasingly restless, their horses dancing sideways as if trying to avoid something they couldn't see. "I know a lot of things," Grant said simply. "I know you raised your hand to that girl more times than a man has. Any right to." I know you threatened to take her baby away if she ever tried to leave. And I know you've never shown that child one moment of genuine love or care." She took a step closer to his horse, and the animal whinnied in distress. "But mostly, I know you ain't taking either of them anywhere today." Inside the house, Kinsley was staring through the window with tears streaming down her face. "Who is she?" she whispered. "And why can't they see her properly?" "My grandmother," Landon said, his voice thick with emotion he thought he'd buried. "Years ago, she raised me after my parents died. Used to tell me stories about angels and signs, about how the Lord works in mysterious ways." He watched as Gran continued her strange confrontation with Manning. "I thought they were just stories." "Boss," the scarred man called out urgently. "The horses won't go forward. Something spooked them bad." Manning yanked on his reins, cursing, but his mount refused to advance another step. Around him, his men's horses were exhibiting the same behavior, backing away from something they could sense but not see, their eyes rolling white with terror. "This ain't over," Manning shouted, his voice cracking with frustrated rage. "You hear me, Noel? I'll be back with more men, with legal papers, with whatever it takes." "You're welcome to try," Gran called back pleasantly. "Though I suspect you'll find the way a mite harder to navigate next time." As if to punctuate her words, the wind picked up again with sudden violence, driving snow so thick it was like a white curtain falling between the ranch and the riders. When it cleared moments later, Manning and his men were retreating, their horses moving with obvious relief as they put distance between themselves and whatever presence they couldn't see, but definitely felt. Gran turned toward the house and smiled, raising her hand in a wave that was achingly familiar. Then she, too, began to fade as the storm swirled around her. But just before she disappeared completely, she mouthed words that chilled Landon to the bone. "He'll be back with the law." 3 days passed in eerie calm. The storm continued to rage. Outside, but inside the ranch house, something had fundamentally shifted. The white feathers multiplied each night, appearing not just in Ivy's crib but scattered throughout the house, like blessings made manifest. Kinsley found them in her coffee cup each morning, soft as wishes and warm to the touch. Landon discovered them tucked into his coat pockets, wrapped around his rifle barrel, even nestled in the pages of his Bible. But it was the doves that truly marked the change. They came at dawn and dusk, dozens of them, perching on the windowsills and eaves despite the bitter cold. They sang in harmonies that made the storm's fury seem like a lullaby, their voices weaving together in melodies that brought tears to Kinsley's eyes and peace to little Ivy's restless nights. "It's like they're standing guard," Kinsley said on the third morning, watching the birds through frost-etched glass, while Ivy nursed contentedly in her arms. The baby had grown noticeably stronger since their arrival, her cheeks rosier, her grip more certain when she grasped at the feathers that seemed to follow her everywhere. Landon nodded, sipping coffee that tasted of hope and second chances. "Gran always said angels don't look like what we expect. Sometimes they come as strangers seeking shelter, sometimes as birds in a storm." He paused, watching a dove land on the windowsill and fix its dark eyes on him. "Sometimes as feathers in a baby's crib." The peace shattered that afternoon when hoofbeats thundered across the snow-packed yard once again. But this time, Manning had brought reinforcements, 24 men wearing badges and carrying official papers, led by a federal marshal whose cold eyes spoke of a man who'd never met a law he wouldn't bend for the right price. Marshal Cora Fallon dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence, her hand resting casually on her pistol. Behind her, Manning sat his horse with the satisfied smile of a man who'd bought himself the legitimacy he needed. "Landon Noel," Marshal Fallon called out, her voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "I have a federal warrant for the return of one Ivy Manning to her legal father, and another for the arrest of Kinsley Parrish on charges of kidnapping and theft." Inside the house, Kinsley went white as the feathers surrounding them. "Legal father," she whispered, the words bitter as poison on her tongue. "He never wanted her until I took her away. Now she's just another possession to be reclaimed." "They can't have her," Landon said. But even as he spoke, he could see the futility of their situation. Federal marshals, legal papers, 24 armed men against one ex-sheriff and a woman with a baby. The odds were impossible. That's when the doves began to sing. The it started as a single voice, pure and crystalline, rising above the wind. Then another joined it, and another, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their harmony. The sound was so beautiful, so achingly pure, that several of the deputies actually lowered their weapons, their faces slack with wonder. "What in the hell?" Marshal Fallon muttered, looking around with confusion. The horses were becoming restless. Again, ears flattened, eyes rolling. "Where's that music coming from?" Manning's face was twisted with rage and something approaching panic. "Just get the baby," he snarled. "I don't care what games they're playing. Get my daughter, and let's go." But as the marshal started toward the house, the strangest thing happened. The snow around the porch began to melt, revealing green grass beneath. Not the brown, dormant grass of late October, but the vibrant green of spring. Flowers began to bloom in impossible profusion. Roses, lilies, daisies, creating a perfect circle of life and beauty around the ranch house. "Sweet Jesus," one of the deputies whispered, crossing himself. "It's a miracle." Marshal Fallon stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the blooming garden that had appeared as if by magic. That's not possible. It's 20 degrees below freezing." The dove's song grew louder, and now Landon could see them, dozens upon dozens, perched on every available surface, their white feathers gleaming like stars against the storm-dark sky. But more than that, he could see the figures standing among them, transparent as morning mist but unmistakably real. His grandmother, her silver hair shining, and beside her other shapes, other guardians drawn by innocence and love. "Do you see them?" Kinsley breathed, wonder replacing fear in her voice. "Some of us do," came a new voice, and Landon's heart nearly stopped as another figure materialized from the swirling snow. This one was solid, real, walking with the measured pace of authority earned rather than bought. Sheriff Dahlia Garrison of the county stepped into view, her badge gleaming on her coat, her weathered face set in lines of grim determination. Behind her rode a half-dozen deputies, their faces hard as winter stone. "Marshal Fallon," Sheriff Garrison said pleasantly, though her hand rested on her sidearm. "Fancy meeting you here. I was wondering when you'd show up to serve those federal warrants." "Sheriff," Marshal Fallon replied warily, "this is federal business. You have no jurisdiction here." "Oh, but I do." Garrison smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf. "See, I've been investigating Mr. Manning here for the better part of 6 months. Amazing what a woman will tell you when she thinks her husband can't reach her anymore." She gestured toward Kinsley. "Turns out there's quite a few ladies in Wyoming with stories to tell about Trey Manning's hospitality." Manning's face went purple. "You can't prove anything, and even if you could, 3 women dead." Garrison continued conversationally. "2 more missing. All of them tried to leave you at some point, didn't they, Trey? All of them had children you claimed as your own." She pulled a thick folder from her saddlebag. "I've got enough evidence here to hang you twice over, including testimony from your own men about what happens to women who cross you." The scarred man, Cruz, suddenly spurred his horse toward the tree line, but one of Garrison's deputies was faster. The crack of a rifle echoed across the valley, and Cruz tumbled from his saddle into the snow. "Now that's interesting," Garrison mused. "Man runs when he hears talk of testimony. Makes you wonder what he's got to hide." Marshal Fallon was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Even if that's true, I still have federal warrants issued based on false information provided by a wanted criminal." Garrison interrupted. "Funny how that works out, isn't it?" She held up another set of papers. "I've got county warrants too, Marshal, and mine take precedence on county land." The dove's song reached a crescendo, and the circle of blooming flowers expanded outward, reaching toward Manning's horse. The animal reared in terror, dumping its rider into the snow among the impossible roses. Manning scrambled to his feet, his expensive coat torn, his face a mask of desperate fury. "This isn't over," he screamed. "You think some parlor tricks and local law can stop me? I own judges, senators. You own them," came a whisper that seemed to come from the wind itself. Landon's grandmother stepped forward, visible now to everyone present, her form shimmering but undeniably real. "But the dead have long memories, Trey Manning, and the innocent cry out for justice." Around her, other figures began to materialize, women in torn dresses, children with frightened eyes. All the victims Manning had silenced over the years. They said nothing, but their presence filled the air with an accusation that no amount of money or influence could silence. Marshall Fallon took one look at the gathering spirits and began backing toward her horse. I think, I think there's been a mistake here, she stammered, but Manning pulled a hidden gun, and his face held the desperate madness of a cornered animal. The gun appeared in Manning's hand like a serpent striking, its black metal a stark contrast to the impossible garden blooming around him. His eyes held the wild desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble, all his power and influence rendered meaningless by forces he couldn't understand or control. If I can't have what's mine, he snarled, swinging the weapon toward the house where Kinsley and Ivy waited, then nobody can. Time seemed to slow, the way it does in moments when everything hangs balanced on a knife's edge. Landon saw the gun rising, saw Manning's finger tightening on the trigger, saw death approaching the two people who had somehow become more precious to him than his own life. But the doves moved faster than mortal eyes could follow. They came like a white avalanche, their wings beating in perfect synchronization, their bodies forming a living shield between Manning and his intended targets. The gun fired, the sound sharp as breaking glass in the crystalline air, but the bullet vanished into the storm of feathers and grace. Manning screamed in rage and confusion, firing again and again, but each shot was swallowed by the protective barrier of wings and light. The doves sang as they flew, their voices weaving together in a harmony so pure it made the very air shimmer with holiness. "Stop him!" Sheriff Garrison shouted to her deputies, but they stood frozen, watching in awe as something beyond their understanding played out before their eyes. That's when Landon's grandmother stepped forward, walking through the chaos as if she were strolling through a Sunday garden. She reached out and placed one translucent hand over Manning's gun, and suddenly the weapon was no longer there, simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. "Enough," she said quietly, but her voice carried the weight of mountains, the authority of justice long delayed but never denied. "You've hurt enough people, child. It's time to face what you've done." The spirits of Manning's victims began to close in around him, not with violence, but with the inexorable patience of truth finally coming to light. He spun wildly, trying to escape their silent accusation, but everywhere he turned, another face appeared, another life he'd destroyed staring back at him with eyes that held no hatred, only sorrow for what he'd chosen to become. "No," he whispered. Then louder, "No? I'm Trey Manning. I own half of Wyoming. You can't." His words cut off as he stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the impossible roses that had sprung up around him. He fell heavily, and when he tried to rise, the flowers had grown up around his arms and legs, not binding him with thorns, but holding him gently, firmly, with stems soft as silk but strong as iron. "Sometimes," Grant said, looking down at him with infinite compassion, "the only way to save a soul is to stop it from causing any more harm." Sheriff Garrison approached slowly, her hand on her weapon but her face filled with wonder. "I've been a lawwoman for 30 years, she said softly, "and I've never seen anything like this." "The law comes in many forms," Gran replied with a gentle smile. "Some wear badges, some wear wings, and some bloom in gardens where no flowers should grow." She gestured toward Manning, who had stopped struggling and now lay still among the roses, his eyes staring up at the storm-dark sky with an expression of shocked understanding. "He'll live, but he won't be hurting anyone else. The roses will see to that." Marshall Fallon was already mounting her horse, her face pale as winter snow. I think I need to review those warrants more carefully," she stammered, her official confidence completely shattered. "You do that," Garrison said dryly. "And while you're at it, you might want to look into who's been signing federal papers based on the word of wanted criminals." As the marshal and her remaining men retreated through the snow, the doves began to settle, perching on the house's eaves and windowsills like living decorations. Their song softened to a gentle lullaby, and the impossible garden around the porch took on a warm, golden glow despite the continuing storm. Inside the house, Kinsley sat by the window with Ivy in her arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. The baby gurgled happily, reaching toward the feathers that continued to drift through the air like blessings made visible. "It's over," Landon said, settling beside them on the old sofa his grandfather had carved from local pine. "He can't hurt you anymore." "I know." Kinsley's voice was soft with wonder. "But how? How is any of this possible?" Before Landon could answer, his grandmother appeared in the doorway one last time, her form already beginning to fade as the crisis passed. "Love, child," she said simply. "Love calls to love, and innocence draws protection like a magnet draws iron. That baby of yours came into this world surrounded by grace, and grace don't abandon its own." She looked at Landon with eyes full of pride and sorrow. "You've been hiding from life for too long, grandson. Afraid to love again because love sometimes brings loss. But look at what you found when you opened your heart to strangers in need." Landon felt tears he'd held back for 3 years finally spilling over. "I miss you, Gran. I miss Sarah and the baby we never got to hold." "They're not gone," she said gently. "Love never dies, it just changes form. Sometimes it becomes feathers in a crib, sometimes flowers in the snow, sometimes the courage to shelter those who need protecting." She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had when he was a boy sitting at her feet, listening to stories of miracles and grace. "Your Sarah's watching over you, just like I am. And that little one you lost? He's playing in gardens, more beautiful than anything you can imagine, waiting for the day you'll hold him again." As the sun set behind the storm clouds, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Gran's form became translucent as morning mist. "Take care of them," she whispered, "and let them take care of you. That's how love works. It grows when it's shared." She faded away like a dream remembered upon waking, leaving only the scent of roses and the soft whisper of dove wings. 6 months later, when the snow had melted and real flowers bloomed in the garden that had appeared so impossibly that winter night, Landon stood at the altar of the small church in town. Kinsley wore his grandmother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue and lavender, while baby Ivy, now walking and babbling her first words, scattered rose petals down the aisle with the serious concentration that only toddlers possess. The doves still came sometimes, especially when Ivy was restless or when storms threatened. They would perch outside her window and sing their impossible songs until she smiled and clapped her hands with delight. The townspeople had grown accustomed to the sight, though they still crossed themselves when the birds appeared, recognizing a miracle even when they couldn't explain it. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a single white feather drifted down from the church rafters, landing gently on Ivy's dark hair like a blessing from above. Some folks say that if you drive out to the old Noel ranch on quiet winter nights, you can still hear singing carried on the wind, voices raised in harmonies too beautiful for this world, reminding all who listen that love never dies. It just takes new forms, and sometimes those forms have wings. Well now, if that don't warm your heart like fresh coffee on a cold morning, I don't know what will. If this tale of love, miracles, and second chances touched your soul, be sure to hit that like button and let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from today, whether it's a big city apartment or a quiet country ranch. We love hearing from folks all around the world who believe in the power of love to work miracles.